My daughter rejected me at her graduation after I raised her alone, so I stepped away quietly, and she finally understood what she lost. I'm a 38-year-old dad, and I've raised my daughter, Emma, on my own since the day she was born. Her mother left when she was barely 2, vanishing from our lives without explanation. From that moment on, it was just the two of us, navigating a world that felt heavy and endless, but I didn't mind. I worked long hours at a construction job downtown, sometimes pulling double shifts just to keep the rent paid and ensure she had everything she needed. Evenings were spent cooking her dinner, helping with homework, and occasionally squeezing in a little fun movie nights on the couch. Trips to the park on weekends, birthdays celebrated with homemade cakes and hand-picked gifts. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours, and I took pride in every bit of it. Being a single parent was exhausting, but it was worth it when Emma smiled at me, her small victories and laughter feeling like my own. I tried to show her every day that she was loved, that she mattered, and that our little family, even broken as it was, could thrive. Friends and neighbors often commented on how well she was turning out. I'd nod with quiet pride even though I knew the truth. She wasn't always as appreciative as she could be. Sometimes, she'd shrug off my efforts with a tired eye roll or a half-hearted thanks. And though I never said it aloud, it stung more than I liked to admit. Emma was entering her teenage years now, and the signs were subtle, but unmistakable. She wanted more independence, sometimes arguing about curfews or insisting she didn't need my guidance. A small comment about my old-fashioned rules here. A short sigh, it was all little things, but they started to accumulate. I'd catch myself wondering if all the sacrifices, all the long nights and skipped lunches, were really making a difference in her eyes. Still, I held on to optimism, believing that eventually she'd recognize how much I'd done for her, how much I'd given up, and how much love had gone into raising her alone. But lately, there was a chill in the air, something I couldn't ignore. That tiny distance growing between us felt heavier than any workday, and I sensed that the real challenges were just beginning. Emma's teenage years hit like a storm I wasn't prepared for. She was 14 when I first noticed the shift. Not dramatic. It's just a subtle edge in her voice, a sharper tone when she answered me, and a reluctance to share even small details about her day. I tried to chalk it up to normal teenage moodiness, but deep down, I felt a gnawing worry. I remember one Friday evening, after a long week at work, I cooked her favorite pasta, set the table, and waited for her to come downstairs. She shuffled in, headphones around her neck, barely making eye contact. "I'm not that hungry," she mumbled, and walked past me, leaving the half-full plate on the table. My chest tightened. I'd spent hours on that meal, just to see it dismissed. School became another battleground. Emma would rush through homework, asking questions with impatience, or complaining that my explanations were too slow. I could feel her frustration bubbling over, directed at me, and it hurt worse than any physical exhaustion. "Dad, I can do this myself," she snapped one evening, shoving her textbook aside. I tried to stay calm, forcing a small smile. "I know you can, but I just want to help." She rolled her eyes and left the room. I sat there, staring at the empty chair across from me, wondering when my little girl had become a stranger in our own home. Even outside of schoolwork, small betrayals appeared. She'd argue over chores, complain about rules I thought were fair, and sometimes mutter things under her breath about boring dad life. Friends of hers, who came over for sleepovers or weekend hangouts, would sometimes laugh at her jokes, at my expense, and she wouldn't correct them. I caught myself feeling a quiet sting of humiliation and sadness. I knew part of it was normal growing up behavior, but there was something sharper under it all. A subtle disregard that I couldn't ignore, and yet I still believed that my constant presence, my tireless efforts, would eventually be enough. I held on to hope that Emma would notice my sacrifices, appreciate the life I'd built for her, and understand the love that had never wavered, even when hers seemed to. But every small rebellion, every dismissive word, chipped away at that hope, leaving me wondering if the real challenges of fatherhood were only just beginning. Things started slipping further when Emma hit 15. It wasn't huge, obvious betrayals at first, just little lies. Tiny omissions, but over time they piled up, each one a small jab that made my chest ache. One evening, I found out she had skipped a study group her teacher had recommended. When I asked why, she shrugged and said, "I didn't feel like it. No apology, no concern." I could feel the frustration boiling inside me, but I tried to stay calm. "Emma, that study group could have helped you with your grades," I said, trying to sound reasonable. She rolled her eyes, muttered something about "you don't get it," and walked away. That was the first real time I noticed a hint of outright disrespect, kind that stings deeper than tired muscles after a long day of work. Then came the social betrayals. Friends would come over, and I'd catch her exaggerating stories or blaming me for things I hadn't done just to seem cool in front of them. Once one of her classmates asked why she always ate alone in the cafeteria. She said it was because her dad made life miserable at home. I froze when I heard it. Misunderstood or not, it hit like a punch in the gut. I spent that night staring at her empty room, the laughter of her friends echoing faintly from outside the window, feeling completely powerless. The tipping point came with a teacher's email. She mentioned Emma's participation had declined, hinted that she seemed more concerned with social approval than her studies. I couldn't help but feel partly responsible, but also betrayed after everything I'd done. Was it too much to expect her to at least show some gratitude? That evening, I tried talking to her calmly. "Emma, I know you're growing up, but you're pushing people away, including me. I'm just trying to help." She looked at me with a mixture of annoyance and defiance, shook her head and said, "You don't understand anything about my life." That moment lingered in my mind, heavy and suffocating. It was the first real sense that my daughter, the little girl I had sacrificed everything for, might not fully recognize or even value my efforts. And yet, I clung to the hope that this phase was temporary, that one day she'd see the love behind the discipline and the sacrifices. But there was a quiet fear growing inside me, that some lessons might take longer than I could endure. Senior year arrived with a mix of excitement and anxiety swirling in my chest. Emma was 16 now, on the cusp of adulthood, and graduation loomed in the near future like both a promise and a threat. I wanted to savor these last years of high school with her, to attend every event, take pictures, celebrate each milestone, but there was a tension I couldn't ignore. She had grown distant, spending more time with friends, texting endlessly, and brushing off anything I suggested. Even when I tried to help with college prep or offer advice, her responses were clipped, her attention elsewhere. I began to notice the whispers among relatives and neighbors, subtle comments about how independent she was becoming. As if my role in her life was fading into the background, I poured myself into preparing for her graduation, buying her a gift I thought she'd treasure, planning a small family celebration, imagining the proud smile I'd see on her face as she walked across the stage. But beneath that optimism, a pit of unease was growing. At dinner one night, she casually mentioned she had other plans for the ceremony, brushing aside my excitement as though it were inconsequential. "I think I'll sit with friends this year, Dad. You don't have to come," she said with an offhand shrug. I froze mid-bite, trying to process the words, but she was already scrolling through her phone, oblivious to the tension she'd just created. I reminded myself to stay calm. Maybe she just wanted independence. Maybe she didn't realize the weight of what she was saying. Still, the pang in my chest was sharp, like the first real crack in the foundation I had built around our lives. I couldn't shake the feeling that the relationship I had nurtured with sleepless nights, extra shifts, and countless sacrifices was starting to fray at the edges. And then came the subtle hints from relatives. Passing comments about her glamorous friends or big plans without family, innocent in tone but loaded with implication. Each remark hit me with quiet dread, a foreshadowing I couldn't ignore. I kept telling myself I was overreacting, but deep down, a small, uncomfortable truth was settling in. The real challenge wasn't her leaving home someday. It was that she might already be emotionally drifting away from me. I stared at her room that night, half lit by the glow of her phone screen, and a cold thought crept in: what if my presence, all my sacrifices, weren't enough for her after all? And I couldn't help but wonder, silently, what graduation day would really look like. It hit me hard one evening when Emma dropped a line that felt like a dagger. We were sitting in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator and faint traffic outside filling the silence. I casually mentioned my plans to be at her graduation, excited to see her walk across that stage. She looked up from her phone, a small, dismissive smirk on her face, and said, "Honestly, Dad, you don't really need to be there. I think I'd rather have Mom or my friends sit with me." The words froze me. For a moment, the hum of the refrigerator seemed unbearably loud, like the silence around me had grown into a wall. I wanted to argue, to remind her of every sacrifice, every late night, scraped knee I had bandaged, every homework problem I had helped her solve. But the words caught in my throat. I simply nodded, swallowed the lump in my throat, and said quietly, "Okay, I understand." Inside, my chest ached with a mix of disbelief, hurt, and a quiet, simmering anger I didn't know how to release. After that, the tension only escalated. Every conversation felt like a battle of subtle dismissals, eye rolls, and sharp, almost casual critiques of my parenting. "You don't get it, Dad," she said one night as I suggested a summer program she could join. "You're so old-fashioned. I have my own life." My stomach churned. I'd raised her alone, sacrificed more than I could ever list, yet here she was, questioning everything I'd done as if it weren't enough. And then came the revelation that shook me in a way nothing before had. A distant relative, during a casual phone call, let slip that Emma had been talking about me behind my back, calling me controlling, outdated, and not really part of her life anymore. My own daughter, the little girl I'd stayed up nights comforting, was framing me as the villain in her story. That night, lying awake on the couch while Emma's laughter echoed from her room, I felt the first real sting of rejection, not just from her words, but from the realization that all my love and sacrifice could be brushed aside so easily. I wondered if maybe stepping back quietly might be the only way for her to truly see what she was risking. And I feared what would happen if I didn't single quotes. Graduation day arrived like a storm I hadn't fully prepared for. I woke early, brewed a cup of coffee, and tried to calm the knot of anxiety in my chest. I dressed carefully, wanting to look presentable not for anyone else, but for her. I carried the small gift I'd picked out weeks ago. It's the one I imagined she'd smile at and cherish, a symbol of everything I had poured into raising her. The drive to the school felt endless, each red light and honking car a countdown to the moment I feared most. When I arrived, the campus was buzzing with proud parents, chatty graduates, and the low hum of excitement. I scanned the crowd for Emma, hoping for a smile, a wave, any acknowledgement that she wanted me there. But when I finally saw her, dressed in her cap and gown, her friends flanked her on either side, laughing, arms linked, phones out. She looked radiant, and for a fleeting second, I was overwhelmed with pride. Then she caught my eye and turned away. She didn't wave, didn't smile. She made no gesture to let me know I belonged in that moment. I stood there, frozen, heart pounding as whispers and stifled laughter from classmates' parents reached me. I could feel the weight of every sleepless night, every extra shift, every scraped knee and homework session crashing down on me, unacknowledged. I wanted to call out, to wave, to force her to see me, but I stopped myself. I realized that any confrontation now would only humiliate both of us. And I couldn't risk damaging the fragile bond that might still exist. So I stayed on the sidelines, quiet, unnoticed. I watched as she received her diploma, smiled for photos with friends, and left the stage without a single glance in my direction. The crushing reality hit me. The little girl I had raised, nurtured, and sacrificed everything for was choosing to reject me publicly. Openly, with no hesitation, I quietly slipped out. The hum of the school halls and applause fading behind me, carrying a lump in my throat and a heart heavy with disappointment. Driving home, I felt a strange mix of grief and clarity. Perhaps stepping back, letting her face the world without me hovering, was the only lesson she could truly learn. But even as that thought settled, a gnawing question lingered. Would she ever realize what she had lost? I got home that evening feeling hollow, like a part of me had been left behind at the graduation ceremony. The house was quiet, the faint ticking of the wall clock echoing through the empty rooms. I sat on the couch, staring at the framed photos of Emma through the years, her first steps, her messy birthday cakes, her shy smiles at school performances. Every memory carried a pang now because it reminded me of how much love I had poured into her life, and how little of it she seemed to recognize. I had reached the rock-bottom moment I never imagined, after years of sacrifice. Sleepless nights and constant work, I felt invisible to my own daughter, for the first time. I allowed myself to really think about stepping away, not permanently, but just enough to let her see the consequences of her choices. I couldn't force gratitude or affection, and every attempt to demand it only seemed to push her further away. My friends called, checked in on me, and offered advice. But nothing could fill the hollow ache of being rejected by the person I loved most. I reflected on every school project I helped with, every scraped knee I bandaged, every time I skipped my own needs to meet hers. It all felt like it had been for nothing, or at least, for nothing she wanted to acknowledge. I spent that night in quiet reflection, walking through our routines in my head. Remembering the first time I held her in my arms and promised I'd always be there, that promise felt fragile now, frayed at the edges by her indifference. Yet, in the middle of that heartbreak, a strange sense of resolve began to take root. I realized that stepping back quietly, giving her the space to understand what she was losing, might be the only way to make her see. I went to bed with a mix of grief and determination, unsure of how long this distance would last, but certain it needed to happen. I knew the coming days would test both of us, and a quiet tension hung over the house, thick enough to feel in the air. As I closed my eyes, I couldn't help but wonder, would this be the moment that finally made her understand, or was I risking losing her forever? In the days that followed, I focused on my own life, trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy and peace. I threw myself into work, stayed late at the office, and took on small projects around the house I had been putting off. The quiet of the empty home was both a relief and a reminder of what I had lost. Without Emma around, there was no chatter, no laughter, no arguing over homework or chores. I kept to my routines, cooking my own meals, tidying up, and even taking long walks to clear my mind. It was strange to exist in the same space where I had spent years nurturing her without the constant push and pull of teenage defiance. Emma, meanwhile, seemed to revel in her newfound independence. She spent hours with friends, attended every social event, and sometimes stayed out late without telling me where she was going. From the outside, it looked like she was thriving, confident, social, and seemingly unbothered by anything at home. But beneath her carefully curated facade, I could sense cracks forming. Reports from relatives and teachers trickled in, missed deadlines, minor conflicts, and growing stress in areas she hadn't had to face before. She hadn't learned consequences while I was hovering. Now she was beginning to encounter the world without a safety net. I resisted the urge to step in immediately. It was painful to watch her stumble, knowing I could make everything easier. But I reminded myself that this distance was necessary. Every misstep, every awkward moment, was part of the lesson she needed to understand what it meant to disregard the sacrifices I had made. The silence between us became a strange kind of communication. I was present in spirit, but intentionally absent in intervention. Some nights, I would hear her laughter drifting from her room, feel a pang of longing, but remind myself that this was the turning point. She needed to face the world without me constantly smoothing the path. And in that tension between love and distance, protection and detachment, I began to feel a cautious sense of hope. Perhaps, eventually, she would realize the weight of what she had taken for granted, and the emptiness she now felt would lead her back to understanding. It didn't take long for the first cracks in Emma's armor to show. A few weeks into my quiet distance, I started hearing from relatives and even her teachers that things weren't going as smoothly as she wanted them to. She had missed an important scholarship deadline, forgotten key assignments, and even argued with a mentor about something she hadn't fully understood. From the outside, it might have looked like teenage chaos, but I knew it was more than that. It was the moment when the consequences of ignoring guidance began to surface. One evening, I got a text from a distant aunt. "Emma's been asking a lot of questions about you lately. Seems like she wants to talk." My chest tightened at the thought. She had never reached out like this before, never asked to hear my perspective, unless it was convenient for her. I debated whether I should respond immediately or wait, but deep down, I knew that my role wasn't to swoop in and fix everything. She needed to come to me willingly, to realize on her own that the stability I had provided was not something to dismiss lightly. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes. She lingered in the kitchen longer, asked for small advice about her homework, and occasionally looked my way with something between hesitation and curiosity. Each small interaction was loaded with tension. I wanted to reach for her, to wrap her in comfort, but I held back, reminding myself that this was part of the lesson. The pride she had leaned on was beginning to fade, replaced with awareness of the support she had taken for granted. Then came the first real sign of regret. She came into the living room one evening, phone in hand, and hesitated before speaking. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Her voice was quiet, almost timid, and I could see the self-consciousness behind her eyes. I nodded, my heart hammering. This was the first real opening. The moment where she was beginning to understand that I wasn't just a background fixture in her life. But even as she approached, I couldn't ignore the lingering tension. Would she truly grasp the depth of what she had rejected? Or was this just a fleeting attempt to appease guilt? When Emma finally approached me, the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. She came into the living room, shifting from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable, her eyes darting toward the floor before meeting mine. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something," she started, her voice hesitant, almost fragile. I nodded slowly, gesturing for her to sit, keeping my own emotions in check. I wanted to stay calm, to let her speak first, to see if she genuinely recognized what had happened or if this was just another fleeting impulse. She took a deep breath and finally looked up at me. "I know I've been difficult. And maybe I didn't appreciate everything you did for me," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly. I felt a twinge in my chest, the mix of relief and lingering hurt biting at me. I shouldn't have said what I did about graduation or about Mom or everything," she continued. "I was wrong, Dad. I didn't understand before." Her words landed like both a bomb and a blade. Relief surged through me. But the weight of all those years of rejection and indifference still lingered. I stayed quiet for a moment, letting the gravity of her confessions sink in. Then I spoke, not with anger, but with calm firmness. "Emma, I raised you alone. I sacrificed, worried, and stayed up nights for you. I didn't do it for recognition or thanks. I did it because I love you. But when you dismissed me, publicly or privately, it hurt in ways you can't imagine. Love doesn't mean you get to take it for granted." My voice shook slightly, though I kept my composure. There was a long pause as she absorbed my words, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Finally, she whispered, I understand now. I see it, Dad. I really do." The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. She wasn't just apologizing. She was beginning to grasp the weight of what she had risked losing. I felt a mix of vindication and relief, a quiet satisfaction that she was finally confronting the reality of her choices. Yet even in this fragile reconciliation, I knew the journey wasn't over. The path ahead would require patience, understanding, and continued trust, but for the first time in years, I could see a glimmer of hope over the next few weeks. Emma and I began the slow, tentative process of rebuilding our relationship. It wasn't instantaneous. Trust and understanding had been eroded over years of indifference and subtle betrayals. We started with small things, sharing meals without rushing through them, talking about her school projects, and even laughing over memories from her childhood. I noticed her listening more carefully, asking questions instead of dismissing my advice, and, most importantly, acknowledging the sacrifices I'd made without being prompted. One evening, we sat together on the porch, the sun dipping low and painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. She turned to me, hesitating, then said, "I never realized how much you did for me, Dad. I can't believe I didn't see it before." Her voice was soft, almost ashamed. But there was a sincerity in her eyes that made my chest ache with both relief and lingering hurt. I reached over and placed a hand on her shoulder. Not to scold, but to show that I was here, always had been, always would be. We talked for hours that night. reminiscing about old trips, school plays, and late-night homework sessions. For the first time in years, I felt like she truly saw me not just as the person enforcing rules or providing guidance, but as her father who had been quietly supporting her through everything. It was a healing moment, not just for her, but for me as well. I realized that stepping back, letting her face the consequences of her actions, had created the space for this understanding to emerge. By the end of the evening, there was a shift in unspoken acknowledgement between us. Emma didn't need to lavish praise or make grand gestures. Her quiet, consistent presence and her genuine curiosity about my life and advice spoke volumes. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction, climactic payoff that wasn't about drama or confrontation, but about the emotional realization she had finally reached. And yet, even as I savored this fragile peace, I knew we still had a journey ahead, a journey of continued understanding, patience, and the careful rebuilding of the trust that had been tested for so long. Sitting in the living room that evening, I finally allowed myself to breathe, feeling a quiet sense of triumph that had nothing to do with accolades or recognition. Emma was nearby, curled up on the couch with a book, occasionally glancing my way with a small, genuine smile. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't flashy, but it was Reland that was enough. I reflected on the years of late nights, sacrifices, and silent struggles, and I realized that stepping back had been the hardest, yet most powerful choice I had made. By giving her space to understand what she had risked, I had taught her a lesson no lecture could ever convey. She came over and placed her hand on mine, squeezing lightly. "Thanks, Dad. For everything," she said softly. No excuses, no empty words, just honesty. I felt the weight of years of unacknowledged love and effort lift just a little, replaced by a warm sense of connection that had been missing for so long. The pride I felt wasn't about being proved right, but about witnessing her growth, seeing her start to appreciate the quiet sacrifices that had built the foundation of her life as the evening shadows stretched across the room. I understood that this was more than just reconciliation, it was empowerment for both of us. I had learned to step back and trust her to face her own choices, and she had begun to truly recognize the love that had never wavered. It was a subtle, powerful victory, one measured not in grand gestures, but in understanding, respect, and a renewed bond that neither of us would take for granted again. I watched her return to her book, and I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. Quietly, I felt a sense of closure, a calm after years of emotional turbulence. Our journey had been painful, messy, and full of lessons, but in that quiet moment, I knew we had arrived at something stronger, a connection rooted in love, respect, and the hard-won understanding of what it really means to care for someone. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace, not just for myself, but for both of us.